The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the Iraqi landscape as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet and prepared for what should have been a routine close air support mission. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, sat ready on the tarmac at Ballad Air Base. The twin engines hummed with their distinctive whine, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 18 months of deployment. Sarah had always been different from other pilots. While her male counterparts dreamed of sleek fighters and air-to-air combat, she had fallen in love with the ugly, slow, but incredibly tough ground attack aircraft. The A-10 wasn't built for speed or beauty. It was built to survive, to protect ground troops, and to deliver devastating firepower with surgical precision. Much like Sarah herself, the Warthog was underestimated by those who didn't truly understand its capabilities. At 28, Sarah had already earned a reputation as one of the finest A-10 pilots in the squadron. Her call sign, Hammer, reflected her ability to deliver precise, devastating strikes against enemy positions while keeping friendly forces safe. She had completed over 200 combat missions, each one adding to her growing legend among the ground troops who had come to rely on her protection. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence reported Taliban fighters moving through a valley approximately 60 miles north of the base. A special operations team was pinned down and requesting immediate close air support. Sarah's job was to neutralize the threat and provide cover for the extraction team. It was exactly the kind of mission she had trained for. The reason she had chosen to fly the Warthog instead of pursuing a career in faster, more glamorous aircraft, as she taxied toward the runway, Sarah noticed two F-16 Fighting Falcons preparing for takeoff on the adjacent strip. The sleek fighters gleamed in the afternoon sun, their pilots undoubtedly preparing for their own missions. She had encountered F-16 pilots before, and while she respected their skills, she had also noticed their tendency to view A-10 pilots as second-class citizens in the fighter pilot community. The Warthog was too slow, too ugly, too focused on ground support rather than air superiority. Sarah didn't mind the attitude. She knew what her aircraft could do, and more importantly, she knew what she could do with it. The proof was painted on the side of her cockpit, a collection of small symbols that told the story of her combat effectiveness. Each marking represented a successful mission, a life saved, an enemy position destroyed. They were her badges of honor, earned through skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the troops on the ground. The control tower cleared her for takeoff, and Sarah pushed the throttles forward. The Warthog accelerated slowly but steadily down the runway, its heavy armor and weapons load making every takeoff a testament to the aircraft's raw power rather than graceful acceleration. As the wheels left the ground, Sarah felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with each flight. This was where she belonged, in the cockpit of the toughest aircraft in the Air Force inventory, heading into harm's way to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The flight to the target area was routine, the landscape below a monotonous blend of brown and tan that had become all too familiar during her deployment. Sarah used the time to review her mission parameters, check her weapon systems, and mentally prepare for the challenges ahead. Intelligence reports were often incomplete or outdated, and she had learned to expect the unexpected on every mission. As she approached the target area, Sarah's radio crackled to life with the voice of the ground controller. Call sign Reaper 6. The special operations team was still pinned down, taking heavy fire from multiple positions in the rocky terrain below. The controller's voice was calm but urgent, providing coordinates and requesting immediate assistance. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and began her approach, scanning the terrain below for signs of enemy activity. What she found was more complex than the briefing had suggested. The enemy fighters weren't simply moving through the valley. They had established well-fortified positions among the rocks and caves that dotted the landscape. Worse, they were using the terrain to their advantage, making it difficult to distinguish between enemy positions and potential civilian structures in the area. This was going to require the kind of precision and patience that had made Sarah one of the most effective A-10 pilots in theater. Sarah circled the target area at 8,000 feet, using her targeting pod to get a detailed view of the situation below. The special operations team was holed up in a small compound surrounded by higher ground, with enemy fighters positioned in at least 6 different locations. The terrain was a nightmare for close air support, with friendly and enemy forces separated by less than 200 meters in some areas. She keyed her radio and established contact with the team leader on the ground. His call sign was Viper 1, and his voice carried the strain of someone who had been under fire for several hours. "Hammer, this is Viper 1. We've got at least 20 enemy fighters in fortified positions on the ridgeline to our north and east. They're using caves and rock formations for cover, and we can't get a clear shot at them." "Copy that, Viper 1, Sarah responded, her voice calm and professional despite the complexity of the situation. "I'm going to need you to mark your exact position and give me a detailed description of the enemy locations. I don't want any friendly fire incidents on my watch." As Viper 1 provided the details, Sarah mentally constructed a three-dimensional map of the battlefield. This was where her experience and training truly showed. While other pilots might see an impossible situation with too many variables and too much risk, Sarah saw a puzzle that could be solved with the right combination of patience, precision, and firepower. She began her first attack run from the southwest, coming in low and slow to get a clear view of the northernmost enemy positions. The A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon was one of the most devastating weapons in the Air Force inventory, capable of firing 70 rounds per second of 30mm depleted uranium rounds. When properly employed, it could destroy tanks, fortified positions, and enemy personnel with surgical precision. The first burst was perfect, walking a line of destruction across the ridgeline, where muzzle flashes had revealed the enemy positions. The distinctive sound of the GU-8, like a buzzsaw cutting through metal, echoed across the valley. Sarah pulled up and banked hard to the left, already planning her next attack run while scanning for secondary targets. "Outstanding, Hammer," came Viper 1's voice over the radio. "Direct hit on the northern positions. That took out at least half of their effective fire, but we're still taking fire from the eastern ridge." Sarah was already positioning for her second attack when her radar warning receiver began screaming in her headset. The electronic warfare systems detected an incoming surface-to-air missile, a threat that hadn't been mentioned in the intelligence briefing. Someone on the ground had a portable missile system, probably a Russian-made SA-7 or similar weapon. Years of training kicked in as Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers, dropping chaff and flares while pulling the Warthog into a steep diving turn. The missile streaked past her aircraft, missing by less than 50 feet. Her heart rate spiked, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what the A-10 was built for, surviving in hostile airspace where other aircraft wouldn't dare venture. "Viper 1, be advised I'm taking SAM fire from your position," Sarah reported, her voice still remarkably calm. "I need you to identify the source if possible. I can't provide effective support if I'm dodging missiles every time I come in for an attack run." The ground team quickly identified the missile position in a cave opening on the eastern ridge. Sarah adjusted her attack plan, deciding to use one of her AGM-65 Maverick missiles to neutralize the threat. The Maverick was a precision-guided missile, perfect for taking out fortified positions or vehicles, and it would allow her to engage the target from a safer distance. She lined up for the missile shot, using her targeting pod to lock onto the cave entrance where the missile had originated. The Maverick guided itself to the target with deadly accuracy, the explosion sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. Secondary explosions suggested that the enemy had been storing additional weapons or ammunition in the cave. With the missile threat eliminated, Sarah was free to resume close air support for the ground team. She made 3 more attack runs, systematically destroying enemy positions and forcing the remaining fighters to retreat deeper into the mountains. Each pass was executed with textbook precision, her rounds finding their targets while carefully avoiding any risk to the friendly forces below. After 45 minutes of continuous combat, the valley fell silent. Viper 1 reported that all enemy fire had ceased and requested permission to begin their extraction. Sarah remained on station, circling overhead like a protective guardian while the Special Operations team prepared to move to their pickup point. It was then that her fuel gauges caught her attention. The extended combat operations and evasive maneuvers had consumed more fuel than planned. She was still within safe limits for returning to base, but the margin was getting uncomfortably thin. Sarah made a quick calculation and determined she had enough fuel for the return flight, but little reserve for unexpected complications. 20 minutes into her return flight to Balad Air Base, Sarah's worst fears materialized. A red warning light illuminated on her instrument panel, followed immediately by a drop in oil pressure in her left engine. The Warthog shuddered slightly as the engine began to lose power, forcing Sarah to reduce throttle settings to prevent a complete failure. She quickly ran through her emergency checklist, attempting to stabilize the failing engine while calculating her remaining options. The A-10 was designed to fly on one engine if necessary, but her fuel situation had become critical. With the reduced power and increased drag from the damaged engine, she was consuming fuel at a much higher rate than normal. Sarah contacted the air traffic control center and declared an emergency, requesting vectors to the nearest suitable airfield. Her calm, professional demeanor never wavered, even as she faced the very real possibility of having to eject over hostile territory. The controller vectored her toward a small forward operating base about 30 miles from her current position. But even that might be pushing the limits of her remaining fuel. As she nursed the wounded Warthog through the sky, Sarah's radio crackled with a new voice. Aircraft declaring emergency, this is Falcon Flight, 2 F-16s at your 7 o'clock. We heard your Mayday call and are moving to provide assistance. Sarah glanced in her mirrors and spotted the two sleek fighters closing on her position. Their call signs were Falcon 1 and Falcon 2, and from their radio chatter she could tell they were relatively inexperienced pilots, probably on their first or second deployment. Their voices carried a mixture of excitement and uncertainty that reminded her of her own early days in combat. Falcon Flight, this is Hammer, Sarah responded. I've got a failing left engine and critically low fuel. I'm attempting to reach the forward operating base at coordinates. She provided the location and her current altitude and heading. Copy that. Hammer, came the reply from Falcon 1. We'll escort you to the base and provide top cover in case you need to punch out. The F-16 pilots took up positions on either side of Sarah's aircraft, their fighters easily matching the Warthog's reduced speed. From their cockpits they had a clear view of her aircraft, including the battle damage from her recent mission. Bullet holes peppered the fuselage, and hydraulic fluid was streaming from several locations on the aircraft. What the F-16 pilots couldn't see clearly from their positions were the markings painted on the side of Sarah's cockpit. Each small symbol told a story of successful missions, enemy positions destroyed, and American lives saved. There were far more markings than would be expected on a typical A-10, a testament to Sarah's exceptional skill and dedication. Jesus. Hammer, came Falcon 2's voice over the radio, his professional composure slipping slightly. Your bird looks like it's been through a meat grinder. How the hell are you still flying that thing? Sarah allowed herself a slight smile despite the gravity of her situation. She's tougher than she looks, she replied. The A-10 was built to take a beating and keep flying. We've got a saying in the Warthog community. It's not how pretty you look. It's how much punishment you can take and still get the job done. The forward operating base appeared on the horizon, a welcome sight that lifted Sarah's spirits considerably. However, her fuel situation had deteriorated even further, and she wasn't certain she had enough remaining to complete a normal landing pattern. She would have to execute a straight-in approach with no room for error. Falcon Flight, I need you guys to stay high and clear of the pattern, Sarah instructed. I'm going to have one chance at this landing and I can't afford to have any other traffic in the area. Roger that, Hammer, Falcon 1 replied. We'll maintain altitude and keep an eye on you. Good luck down there. Sarah began her approach to the base, configuring her aircraft for landing while continuously monitoring her engine parameters and fuel quantity. The wounded Warthog responded sluggishly to her control inputs, but she compensated with the skill of a pilot who had complete mastery of her aircraft. The runway appeared ahead, and Sarah adjusted her glide path for what she hoped would be her final approach of the day. Her hands were steady on the controls, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. She had trained for situations like this countless times in simulators, but the real thing was always different. There were no second chances, no reset buttons, just skill, experience, and perhaps a little bit of luck. The F-16 pilots watched from above as the battle-damaged A-10 approached the runway, its pilot demonstrating the kind of skill and composure that separated the exceptional pilots from the merely competent. They were witnessing something special, though they didn't yet fully understand the significance of what they were seeing. Sarah's approach was textbook perfect despite the challenging circumstances. She brought the Warthog down in a controlled descent, compensating for the asymmetric thrust from her failing engine with precise rudder inputs. The runway threshold passed beneath her aircraft, and she began her flare for touchdown. The main landing gear contacted the runway with a solid thump, followed immediately by the nose gear. Sarah deployed her speed brakes and applied wheel brakes, bringing the wounded aircraft to a stop with several hundred feet of runway remaining. She had done it, a successful emergency landing with fuel gauges reading practically empty. "Outstanding job, Hammer," came Falcon 1's voice over the radio. That was some impressive flying down there. Sarah shut down her engines and began her post-flight checklist, her hands finally allowing themselves a slight tremor now that the immediate danger had passed. Fire and rescue vehicles surrounded her aircraft, their crews ready to respond to any emergency. Ground personnel quickly chalked the wheels and began examining the battle damage. Above her, the two F-16 pilots were preparing to depart for their original destination when Falcon 2's voice came over the radio with a note of amazement. "Falcon 1, are you seeing what I'm seeing on that A-10? Falcon 1 maneuvered his aircraft for a better view of the grounded Warthog. As he flew past at low altitude, he got his first clear look at the markings on the side of Sarah's cockpit. What he saw made him key his radio immediately. "Tower, this is Falcon 1. We need to extend our time on station. We'd like to get a closer look at that A-10 that just landed." The tower controller, puzzled by the request, granted permission for the F-16s to remain in the area. Both pilots brought their aircraft around for multiple low passes, trying to get a better view of the markings that had caught their attention. What they were seeing was extraordinary. The side of Sarah's cockpit was covered with small painted symbols, each one representing a successful combat mission. There were bombs indicating ground targets destroyed, small airplane silhouettes marking enemy aircraft engaged, and most significantly, dozens of small crosses representing lives saved. "My God," whispered Falcon 2 over the intercom. "How many missions has this pilot flown?" Falcon 1 was equally amazed. In the fighter pilot community, such extensive combat markings were legendary. Most pilots would be lucky to accumulate a fraction of what they were seeing, painted on the side of the A-10. The sheer number of symbols suggested hundreds of combat missions, an almost unprecedented level of combat experience. "Tower, this is Falcon 1, the lead F-16 pilot radioed. "Can you tell us who was flying that A-10? "We'd like to meet this pilot." The tower controller checked his logs and responded, "That was Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Hammer. She's been flying A-10s out of Balad for the past 18 months. Word is she's one of the finest close air support pilots in theater." The F-16 pilots exchanged glances across the distance separating their aircraft. They had heard stories about exceptional A-10 pilots, legends who had accumulated massive amounts of combat time and saved countless lives. But seeing the evidence firsthand was something entirely different. On the ground, Sarah was completing her post-flight inspection when she noticed the two F-16s continuing to circle overhead. She assumed they were simply ensuring she was safe before departing for their own mission. She had no idea that the fighter pilots above her were struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. The maintenance crew chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, approached Sarah with a clipboard and a concerned expression. "Captain, we've got some serious damage here. I count at least 15 bullet holes in the fuselage, and we've got hydraulic leaks in 3 different systems. How the hell did you keep this bird flying?" Sarah smiled and patted the side of her aircraft affectionately. "She's a tough old bird, Chief. The A-10 was built to take punishment and keep fighting. A few bullet holes aren't going to stop her." Rodriguez shook his head in amazement. In his 20 years of aircraft maintenance, he had seen plenty of battle damage, but rarely had he seen an aircraft take such a beating and still make it home safely. The fact that Sarah had managed to execute a perfect emergency landing with such extensive damage spoke volumes about both the aircraft's design and her skill as a pilot. Above them, Falcon 1 made a decision that would surprise his wingman. "Falcon 2, we're going to land at this base. I want to meet this pilot personally." "Are you sure about that?" Falcon 2 responded. "We're supposed to be at our destination in 30 minutes. "This is worth being late for," Falcon 1 replied firmly. "We're looking at something special here, and I want to understand what we've just witnessed." The two F-16s requested permission to land, surprising both the tower controller and Sarah, who was still on the flight line with the maintenance crew. Fighter pilots rarely deviated from their flight plans unless there was an emergency, and both F-16s appeared to be operating normally. The two F-16s landed in formation, their sleek forms contrasting sharply with the battle-scarred A-10 sitting on the ramp. As they taxied to the parking area, Sarah watched with curiosity. wondering why the fighter pilots had decided to land at the small forward operating base. Captain Jake Morrison, callsign Falcon 1, was a 26-year-old F-16 pilot on his second deployment. He had joined the Air Force with dreams of air-to-air combat and had spent countless hours training for fighter-versus-fighter engagements. His wingman, Lieutenant Tom Bradley, callsign Falcon 2, was even younger and on his first combat deployment. As they shut down their engines and climbed out of their cockpits, both pilots were still processing what they had seen painted on Sarah's aircraft. Morrison had heard stories about legendary A-10 pilots, but he had assumed they were mostly exaggerated war stories told in the officers' club. The evidence painted on the side of the Warthog suggested otherwise. Sarah was still talking with the maintenance chief when she noticed the two fighter pilots walking across the ramp toward her aircraft. She recognized them as the pilots who had escorted her during the emergency landing, and she assumed they were coming over to check on her condition. "Captain Mitchell?" Morrison called out as he approached. "I'm Captain Morrison, and this is Lieutenant Bradley. We were your escorts during the emergency landing." Sarah smiled and extended her hand. "Thanks for the escort, Captain. It's always nice to have someone watching your back when things get complicated." Morrison shook her hand, but his eyes kept drifting to the markings on her aircraft. Up close, the symbols were even more impressive than they had appeared from the air. Each one was meticulously painted, representing a successful mission or significant event in Sarah's combat career. "Captain," Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of respect that surprised even him, "I have to ask about these markings. I've never seen anything like this before." Sarah glanced at the symbols painted on her cockpit and shrugged modestly, just keeping track of missions. "It helps the ground crews know which aircraft have seen the most action." Bradley, who had been silently counting the markings, finally spoke up. "Captain, there have to be over 200 symbols here. How many combat missions have you flown?" Sarah paused, considering the question. She had stopped counting her missions after the first 100, focusing instead on the quality of each sortie, rather than the quantity. "Honestly, Lieutenant, I stopped counting a while ago. When you're flying close air support, the important thing isn't how many missions you've completed, it's how many people you've been able to help." Morrison felt a shift in his understanding of what it meant to be a combat pilot. He had been trained to think in terms of air-to-air victories and individual achievements. Sarah's perspective was entirely different. She measured success by the lives she had saved and the ground troops she had protected. "The crosses," Bradley said, pointing to the dozens of small symbols scattered among the bombs and other markings. "What do those represent?" Sarah's expression softened as she looked at the crosses. "Those are for lives saved. Every time I've been able to prevent casualties among our ground troops or extract someone from a dangerous situation, I add one of those. They're the markings I'm most proud of." The two F-16 pilots exchanged glances, both feeling somewhat humbled by what they were hearing. Their training had focused on individual combat effectiveness and personal achievement. Sarah's approach to combat aviation was entirely different. It was about service, sacrifice, and protecting others. Morrison decided to ask the question that had been bothering him since he first saw the markings. "Captain, how long have you been flying combat missions?" "This is my second deployment," Sarah replied. "I've been flying A-10s for about 4 years total, but the last 18 months have been pretty intense. The ground troops need close air support, and there aren't enough of us to go around." Bradley did a quick mental calculation. "That means you've been flying multiple missions per day almost every day for a year and a half." Sarah nodded. "Sometimes 3 or 4 sorties a day when things get busy. The A-10 has excellent turnaround time, and there's always someone on the ground who needs help." Morrison was beginning to understand that he was in the presence of something truly exceptional. Most pilots flew 1 mission per day during combat deployments, if that. The idea of flying multiple combat sorties daily for 18 months was almost incomprehensible. "Captain," Morrison said, his voice now carrying genuine admiration, "I owe you an apology. I think most fighter pilots don't really understand what you A-10 drivers do. We see the slow speed and the focus on ground support, and we assume it's somehow less challenging than air-to-air combat." Sarah smiled, appreciating the honesty. "Different missions, different challenges. You guys train for air superiority and high-speed engagements. We train for precision strikes in complex environments where friendly and enemy forces are often separated by meters rather than miles. Both jobs are important. The maintenance chief interrupted their conversation to inform Sarah that her aircraft would need at least 6 hours of repairs before it would be flyable again. The hydraulic leaks needed to be addressed and several damaged systems would need to be replaced or repaired. "Looks like I'm stuck here for a while," Sarah said. "You guys don't need to hang around on my account. I'm sure you have somewhere important to be." Morrison and Bradley looked at each other, both coming to the same conclusion without needing to discuss it. "Actually, Captain," Morrison said, "our mission can wait. We'd like to stick around and hear more about what you do out here, if you don't mind." Over the next few hours, as Sarah's aircraft underwent repairs, the 3 pilots sat in the small base operations center and talked. What began as casual conversation gradually evolved into something much deeper, a sharing of experiences and perspectives that challenged everything the F-16 pilots thought they knew about combat aviation. Sarah described missions where she had spent hours circling over besieged outposts, providing continuous close air support while ground troops fought for their lives. She talked about the precision required to engage enemy positions that were sometimes less than 50 meters from friendly forces, and the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between saving lives and causing friendly casualties. "The hardest part," Sarah explained, "isn't the flying or even the combat. It's the responsibility. When ground troops call for close air support, they're trusting you with their lives. They're counting on you to be accurate, to be decisive, and to be there when they need you most. That's a weight you carry with you on every mission." Bradley, who had initially been skeptical about the effectiveness of the slow, ungainly A-10, was beginning to understand the unique challenges faced by close air support pilots. "How do you handle the stress?" he asked. "Flying multiple combat missions every day with that level of responsibility has to be incredibly demanding." Sarah considered the question carefully. "You focus on the mission and the people you're trying to help. When you see ground troops who are pinned down by enemy fire, and you know you're the only thing standing between them and disaster, everything else becomes secondary. The stress, the fatigue, the danger. It all takes a backseat to getting the job done." Morrison was struck by the selfless nature of Sarah's approach to combat flying. In fighter training, pilots were taught to think about personal survival and individual achievement. Sarah's entire mindset was focused on protecting others, even at the cost of putting herself in greater danger. "The markings on your aircraft," Morrison said, "they tell an incredible story. I've been flying fighters for 5 years and I've never seen anything like it. How do you maintain that level of effectiveness over such an extended period?" Sarah glanced out the window at her battle-damaged aircraft, where maintenance crews were still working to repair the damage from her latest mission. "The A-10 is an amazing aircraft, but it's only as good as the team that supports it. The maintenance crews, the intelligence analysts, the ground controllers, they're all part of what makes these missions successful. I might be the one in the cockpit, but I'm definitely not doing this alone." As the afternoon wore on, more personnel from the base began to gather around their table. Word had spread quickly that the legendary A-10 pilot known as Hammer was on their base, and many wanted the opportunity to meet her. Ground troops who had been supported by A-10s during their deployments came to shake her hand and share their own stories. One young Army sergeant approached Sarah with obvious emotion. "Captain," he said, his voice thick with feeling, "I was with the unit you pulled out of that ambush near Ramadi 6 months ago. If you hadn't shown up when you did, none of us would have made it home. I just wanted to say thank you." Similar stories emerged throughout the afternoon. Soldiers, Marines, and airmen who had been saved by close air support shared their experiences, each one adding another dimension to Sarah's reputation. The F-16 pilots listened in amazement as story after story confirmed what the markings on Sarah's aircraft had suggested. She was a pilot of almost legendary skill and dedication. As evening approached, Sarah received word that her aircraft repairs were nearly complete. She would be able to return to Balad Air Base before nightfall. Morrison and Bradley also needed to continue to their original destination, but both men felt changed by their encounter. "Captain Mitchell," Morrison said as they prepared to part ways, "I want you to know that this has been one of the most important conversations of my military career. You've shown me what it really means to be a combat pilot, and I'll never look at A-10s or their pilots the same way again." Bradley nodded in agreement. "When we get back to our squadron, we're going to make sure everyone knows what we learned here today. The A-10 community deserves more recognition for what they do. Sarah smiled and shook hands with both pilots. Just remember that we're all on the same team. Whether you're flying fighters, bombers, or ground attack aircraft, we're all here to support the mission and protect each other. As the 3 aircraft prepared for departure, word of Sarah's emergency landing and the respect shown by the F-16 pilots had spread throughout the base and beyond. Her reputation, already substantial within the A-10 community, began to grow within the broader Air Force. The markings on her aircraft were no longer just symbols of her individual achievement, and they had become symbols of the dedication and skill of all close air support pilots. Sarah climbed back into her repaired Warthog, ran through her pre-flight checks, and prepared for the flight back to Balad. As she taxied toward the runway, she reflected on the unexpected encounter with the F-16 pilots. Their respect and admiration had been genuine, but more importantly, they had gained a new understanding of what it meant to serve in combat aviation. The sun was setting over the Iraqi desert as 3 aircraft took off from the small forward operating base, each heading in a different direction, but all carrying the same commitment to excellence and service that had brought them together that day. For Sarah, it was just another day in her extraordinary career as a combat pilot. But for Morrison and Bradley, it was a day that would change their perspective on what it truly meant to be warriors in the sky.